London in 1720. Chapter 1. The Physical City. Streets, Buildings, and the Thames. The Rebuilt Metropolis. In 1720, London stood as the largest and wealthiest city in Western Europe, a sprawling metropolis of approximately 630,000 souls. Just over 50 years had passed since the Great Fire of 1666 had consumed the ancient medieval city, and the rebuilt London was still relatively new, its brick buildings and stone churches representing a dramatic transformation from the timber city that had burned. The fire had destroyed 80% of the city of London, the ancient square mile that formed the commercial heart of the metropolis. From those ashes had risen a new city, built according to stricter regulations that mandated brick and stone construction to prevent future catastrophes, though the grand plans drawn up by Christopher Wren and others for a completely redesigned city with wide boulevards and geometric squares had never been implemented. The rebuilt city was nonetheless more orderly and safer than its predecessor. London in 1720 extended far beyond the ancient city walls. Westminster, a mile to the west, housed Parliament, the Royal Court, and the machinery of government. The areas between the city and Westminster had filled with development, creating a continuous urban fabric. To the north, east, and south, the city spread into former fields and villages, absorbing communities that had once been separate. The boundaries of London were imprecise and constantly expanding. Built-up areas stretched from Wapping and Limehouse in the east to Hyde Park in the west, from Islington in the north to Southwark across the river. Beyond these developed areas, villages like Hampstead, Hackney, and Chelsea remained distinct communities, though London's relentless growth would eventually swallow them all. The River Thames. The River Thames was London's most important feature, the reason for the city's existence, and the artery of its commerce. This broad tidal river connected London to the sea, and thus to the trade routes that encircled the globe. Every commodity imaginable flowed up the Thames into London's wharves. The Pool of London, the stretch of river below London Bridge, was crowded with vessels from morning to night. Great merchant ships brought goods from the East Indies, the Americas, Africa, and every European port. Coastal vessels delivered coal from Newcastle, the fuel that heated London's homes and powered its nascent industries. Smaller craft of every description filled the remaining space, creating a forest of masts that astonished visitors from abroad. There was only one bridge across the Thames in 1720, London Bridge. This ancient structure, rebuilt in stone in the medieval period, still supported buildings along its entire length. Shops and houses rose 4 and 5 stories above the roadway, creating a tunnel-like passage that was dark even at midday. The bridge was perpetually congested, with carts, carriages, and pedestrians competing for the narrow passage. Because there was only one bridge, Londoners relied heavily on watermen to ferry them across and along the river. These boatmen operated small rowing craft, taking passengers from the numerous stairs and landing places along both banks. Thousands of watermen plied their trade on the Thames, and they were known for their rough manners and colorful language. "Oars! Oars!" they would cry, competing for fares. The Thames also served as a sewer. The refuse of 600,000 people flowed into the river through countless drains and ditches. Dead animals floated on its surface, yet Londoners continued to draw drinking water from the same river, contributing to the diseases that periodically swept through the city. Streets and roads. The street pattern of 1720 London combined ancient medieval lanes with the somewhat wider streets of the rebuilt city. The grand geometric plan that Wren had proposed after the fire had been rejected as impractical, so most streets followed their original medieval courses, though rebuilt with brick buildings rather than timber. The main thoroughfares were wider than before the fire. Cheapside, the great market street running through the heart of the city, was now a broad avenue lined with handsome brick buildings. Fleet Street connected the city to Westminster, passing through Temple Bar, the ancient gateway that marked the city's western boundary. The Strand continued westward to Westminster, lined with the mansions of the nobility. Street paving varied dramatically. The main streets were paved with cobblestones, though maintenance was inconsistent and potholes were common. Side streets and alleys might be unpaved, turning to deep mud in wet weather. Street cleaning was the responsibility of householders, who were required to sweep before their properties, but enforcement was lax. Street lighting was minimal. Oil lamps were required on main streets during the dark months, but they provided only dim illumination. Much of London was pitch black after sunset, and wise citizens avoided unnecessary travel after dark. Link boys carrying torches offered to guide pedestrians through the darkness for a fee. The newer developments to the west were more elegantly planned. Squares surrounded by uniform brick houses were becoming fashionable. Hanover Square, completed in the 1710s, set a pattern that would be repeated throughout the 18th century. These squares provided light, air, and open space, in contrast to the crowded streets of the older city. Buildings and architecture. The architectural character of 1720 London was predominantly late Stuart and early Georgian, with brick as the dominant building material. The fire regulations after 1666 had required brick or stone construction, and the familiar red brick facades of London were largely a product of this requirement. Christopher Wren's churches dominated the skyline. His masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, had been completed in 1710 after decades of construction. Its great dome rose above the surrounding buildings, visible from miles away and establishing London's identity. The 51 parish churches Wren had designed to replace those destroyed in the fire punctuated the cityscape with their distinctive steeples. Domestic architecture followed established patterns. Houses for the wealthy featured symmetrical facades, sash windows, a relatively new innovation, and classical details. Interiors might be decorated with wood paneling, imported wallpapers, and fine furniture. The houses of the middling sort were smaller, but followed similar principles. The poor lived in older buildings, subdivided houses, or the increasingly crowded tenements of the eastern districts. Public buildings reflected the confidence of a growing commercial empire. The Royal Exchange, rebuilt after the fire, was the center of mercantile activity, where merchants gathered to conduct business. The Custom House processed the duties on imported goods. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, occupied premises in the city. The Tower of London remained a royal fortress, armory, and prison, its medieval walls and towers evoking centuries of English history. The crown jewels were displayed there, and the Tower Menagerie housed exotic animals, including lions that visitors could view for a fee. The contrast of old and new. London in 1720 presented dramatic contrasts between its various districts. The rebuilt city was relatively modern and orderly. Westminster retained its character as a center of government and aristocratic residence, but other areas preserved much older character. Southwark, across the river, was not covered by the building regulations that had transformed the city. Here, older timber buildings still stood, and the area retained a somewhat rough character. The prisons of Southwark, including the Marshalsea and the King's Bench, housed debtors and other unfortunates. The eastern districts were growing rapidly, but in a haphazard manner. Wapping, Whitechapel, and Spitalfields were filling with workers who served the maritime trades or the silk weaving industry. Buildings were often poorly constructed, and overcrowding was becoming a problem. The western districts were more fashionable. St. James's, developed around the royal palace, attracted the aristocracy and the wealthy. Covent Garden, originally laid out as an elegant piazza, was becoming a center of entertainment and commerce. These areas featured the finest architecture and the cleanest streets. Chapter 2. The People. Population, Classes, and Social Structure. A city of 600,000. London in 1720 contained approximately 630,000 inhabitants, making it by far the largest city in Britain and one of the largest in the world. Only Paris rivaled it in Western Europe, and London was growing faster. 1 in 10 English people lived in London, an extraordinary concentration of population. This vast population was packed into an area of perhaps 15 square miles of developed land. Densities were highest in the older parts of the city and in the working-class districts to the east. Families of 6 or 8 might occupy 2 rooms, sharing a building with several other families. London's population growth was not driven by natural increase. In fact, deaths exceeded births in most years. The city was so unhealthy that it consumed people faster than they could reproduce. Growth came from constant immigration, primarily from the English countryside, but also from Scotland, Ireland, and abroad. Young people seeking opportunity, the dispossessed, the ambitious, and the desperate all flowed into London. Many of these immigrants did not survive long. Diseases that spread easily in crowded conditions carried us off thousands every year. Smallpox was particularly deadly, killing many children and leaving survivors scarred. Typhus, known as jail fever for its prevalence in prisons, was endemic in the poorer districts. Tuberculosis slowly killed its victims over months or years. The aristocracy and gentry. At the apex of London society stood the aristocracy, the hereditary peers who held titles and sat in the House of Lords. Dukes, marquesses, earls, viscounts, and barons formed a small elite of perhaps a few hundred families who wielded enormous power and enjoyed vast wealth. Aristocratic families maintained grand houses in London, particularly in the fashionable districts around St. James's and Westminster. These houses were staffed by dozens of servants and furnished with old master paintings, tapestries, and every luxury. During the social season, aristocratic families gathered in London for a whirlwind of court functions, balls, dinners, and political intrigue. The gentry, wealthy landowners without noble titles, formed a larger class below the aristocracy. Knights, baronets, and esquires aspired to aristocratic manners, while maintaining their country estates. Many came to London for the season, or to conduct business, maintaining townhouses for these visits. Political power was concentrated in these upper ranks. The great offices of state were filled by peers and their relatives. Parliamentary seats were controlled through influence and patronage. The country was run by and for the landed elite, though they were increasingly intermarried with wealthy merchant families. The middling sort. Below the aristocracy and gentry, but above the common people, were the middling sort, a diverse group that included merchants, professionals, shopkeepers, and master craftsmen. This was a growing class, enriched by London's expanding commerce and eager to demonstrate their respectability. Wealthy merchants might rival or exceed the gentry in income, though they lacked the social prestige of land ownership. They lived in substantial houses in the city or the newer Western developments. They sent their sons to good schools, and sought to marry their daughters to men of higher status. Professionals formed another important segment of this class. Lawyers were particularly prominent in London, where the Great Court sat at Westminster, and the Inns of Court trained practitioners. Doctors, clergymen, and military officers also belonged to this respectable category. Shopkeepers occupied the lower reaches of the middling sort. They kept their shops on the ground floors of buildings where they also lived with their families and perhaps an apprentice or two. They aspired to respectability and worked to distinguish themselves from the laboring poor. The working poor. The great majority of Londoners belonged to the laboring classes. They earned their bread through physical work, whether in trades, domestic service, or casual labor. Their lives were hard, their futures uncertain, and their margin of survival often thin. Skilled trades employed thousands of workers in traditional crafts: tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, smiths, printers, and dozens of other trades were organized through guilds that regulated entry and maintained standards. Journeymen worked for wages, hoping eventually to become masters with their own shops. The maritime trades employed vast numbers in and around the port. Sailors manned the ships, stevedores loaded and unloaded cargo, lightermen operated the small boats that transferred goods between ships and shore, shipwrights built and repaired vessels, rope makers, sailmakers, and other specialists served the shipping industry. Domestic service was the largest employer of women. Great houses employed hierarchies of servants from housekeeper and butler down to scullery maids and kitchen boys. Even modest households might keep a single maid who performed all domestic tasks. Service provided food and shelter, but little freedom. Servants were at their employer's command at all hours. The silk weaving industry of Spitalfields employed thousands of workers, many of them descendants of Huguenot refugees who had fled France after 1685. These weavers worked at looms in their own homes, producing fine fabrics for the clothing trade. Though skilled, they were vulnerable to changes in fashion and competition from imports. The desperate poor. At the bottom of society were those who could not find regular work, or who could not work at all. Widows without support, orphan children, the elderly, the disabled, and those simply unable to find employment made up a substantial portion of London's population. Begging was endemic on London streets. Men, women, and children displayed their misery to passers-by, hoping for charitable coins. Some beggars were genuinely desperate. Others were suspected of feigning disability or exaggerating their plight. The distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor was much debated. Prostitution was common, with thousands of women selling their bodies for survival. Covent Garden and the areas around Drury Lane were notorious for streetwalkers. Bawdy houses operated throughout the city, some catering to wealthy clients, others serving common sailors and laborers. Crime offered another means of survival for the desperate. Pickpockets worked the crowded streets and markets. Footpads robbed travelers on the roads approaching London. Housebreakers targeted wealthy homes. A criminal underworld flourished in the rookeries and slums, resisting the limited efforts of law enforcement. Immigrants and minorities. London attracted migrants from throughout the British Isles and beyond. The Scots had arrived in greater numbers since the Union of 1707, which joined Scotland to England in a single kingdom. Many sought opportunities in trade, the professions, or government service. Irish immigrants were numerous, generally occupying the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. They worked as laborers, servants, and in other menial occupations. Anti-Irish prejudice was common, fueled by religious differences, most Irish were Catholic, and competition for jobs. The Huguenots, French Protestants who had fled persecution under Louis XIV, formed a distinctive community in Spitalfields and other areas. Though immigrants, many had arrived a generation or more earlier and were becoming assimilated. Their skills in silk weaving, watchmaking, and other crafts had enriched London's economy. A small Jewish community had existed in London since their readmission under Cromwell in the 1650s. Both Sephardic Jews of Spanish and Portuguese origin and Ashkenazi Jews from Central Europe maintained synagogues and businesses. They faced legal restrictions, but were tolerated in the commercial climate of London. A black population of several thousand lived in London, primarily as servants in wealthy households. Some had been brought from the Caribbean or the American colonies. Others had been born in England. Their legal status was ambiguous, and while slavery was common in the colonies, its status in England itself was uncertain. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Work, Food, and Domestic Existence. The Rhythms of Daily Life. Life in 1720. London followed rhythms that would seem strange to modern observers. Without reliable artificial lighting, activities were governed by sunrise and sunset. The working day began at first light and typically ended at dusk, though some trades continued by candlelight. The city came alive at dawn. Servants lit fires and began their duties. Street vendors appeared with their cries, selling milk, bread, and other necessities. Shops opened their shutters and displayed their wares. The streets filled with people heading to their various occupations. Markets were busiest in the early morning. Householders or their servants visited the markets to buy fresh provisions for the day. Without refrigeration, shopping was a daily necessity. Meat, fish, vegetables, and other perishables had to be consumed quickly before they spoiled. The main meal of the day, called dinner, was typically served in the early afternoon. This was the heaviest meal, when those who could afford it ate meat, vegetables, and other substantial fare. Supper in the evening was lighter. The wealthy might dine later, and dinner hours were gradually shifting toward evening among the fashionable. As darkness fell, the city grew quieter and more dangerous. Shops closed their shutters. The streets emptied of respectable citizens. Nightlife continued in taverns and coffee houses, but wise Londoners knew the risks of walking the dark streets alone. Work and occupations. Work occupied most of the waking hours for the majority of Londoners. The concept of leisure time barely existed for the laboring classes. When not working, they were often sleeping or recovering strength for the next day's labor. Apprenticeship remained the primary path into skilled trades. Boys as young as 10 or 12 were bound as apprentices to master craftsmen for terms of 7 years. They lived in their masters' households, learned the trade, and received minimal wages or none at all. Upon completing their apprenticeship, they became journeymen, working for wages until they could establish their own shops. The working day was long by modern standards. 12 to 14 hours were common in many trades, with only Sunday as a regular day of rest. Some trades observed St. Monday, an unofficial holiday when workers recovered from Sunday's drinking, but this practice was frowned upon by employers and moralists. Women's work was largely confined to the domestic sphere or to a limited range of occupations. Married women were expected to manage households and raise children. Single women and widows worked as domestic servants, seamstresses, laundresses, or in various forms of small trade. Street selling was common, with women hawking everything from oranges to matches. Children worked from an early age. Boys might enter apprenticeships before their teens. Girls helped with domestic tasks or worked alongside their mothers. Street children survived by whatever means they could, selling, begging, running errands, or stealing. The concept of childhood as a protected period of innocence was largely unknown among the working classes. Food and drink. The diet of Londoners in 1720 varied enormously by social class, from the elaborate meals of the wealthy to the meager fare of the poor. Food was one of the most visible markers of status. Wealthy households enjoyed abundant and varied food. Meals might include multiple courses featuring roasted meats, game birds, fish, elaborate pies, and rich desserts. Wine imported from France, Spain, and Portugal accompanied meals. Exotic foods from the colonies were becoming fashionable. Sugar, chocolate, coffee, tea, and spices added variety to the diet. The middling sort ate well, but more simply. Beef was the preferred meat, roasted or boiled and served with vegetables. Bread was consumed in large quantities. Cheese, eggs, and preserved foods supplemented fresh provisions. Beer or ale was the common drink, consumed in remarkable quantities by modern standards. The poor ate what they could afford, which was often inadequate. Bread was the staple, consumed in enormous quantities because it was the cheapest source of calories. It might be supplemented with cheese, bacon, or vegetables when money allowed. Street food provided hot meals for those without kitchens. Pies, hot puddings, and other preparations sold from stalls and barrows. Drinking habits were changing in ways that would have profound consequences. Beer and ale remained staples, consumed at every meal by all classes, but gin was becoming increasingly available and cheap. Distilled from grain, gin offered a quick route to drunkenness, and its consumption was rising rapidly, particularly among the poor. The gin epidemic that would devastate the London poor in subsequent decades was just beginning. Coffee and tea were becoming fashionable, though still relatively expensive. Coffee houses served as centers of business and political discussion, where men gathered to read newspapers, exchange gossip, and conduct transactions. Tea was increasingly popular, particularly among women, though it remained a luxury for most. Housing and domestic life. Housing in London ranged from the grand mansions of the aristocracy to the squalid cellars where the poorest residents huddled. The house one occupied defined one's place in society as clearly as any other marker. Aristocratic townhouses were virtual palaces. They might contain dozens of rooms, drawing rooms for entertaining, dining rooms for formal meals, bedrooms for family and guests, and extensive servants' quarters. Furnishings reflected the wealth and taste of the owners: paintings, tapestries, fine furniture, silver, and porcelain. The middling sort lived in more modest houses, often sharing walls with neighbors in terraced rows. A typical house might have a shop or business on the ground floor, living quarters above, and servants or apprentices in the attic. Furnishings were simpler, but still comfortable: wooden furniture, pewter dishes, linen, and woolen textiles. The working poor lived in crowded conditions. A family might occupy one or two rooms in a subdivided house, sharing a privy and a water supply with several other families. Furniture was minimal: a bed, perhaps shared by the entire family, a table, stools, and essential cooking equipment. Privacy was virtually unknown. The truly destitute lived in conditions that would shock later reformers. Cellars housed families in dark, damp spaces barely fit for habitation. Lodging houses crammed dozens of people into single rooms. In the worst cases, people slept in the streets, under bridges, or in whatever shelter they could find. Health and sanitation. London in 1720 was a profoundly unhealthy place. Life expectancy was significantly lower than in the countryside, and infant mortality was horrifyingly high. Perhaps 1 child in 3 died before reaching their 5th birthday. In the poorest districts, the rate was even higher. Sanitation barely existed by modern standards. There was no sewage system. Human waste went into cesspits beneath buildings, or directly into the streets and the river. Night soil men periodically emptied the cesspits, carting the contents out of the city, but the stench of human and animal waste pervaded the streets. Clean water was scarce. The New River brought water from Hertfordshire, and the London Bridge Waterworks pumped river water to some neighborhoods, but many Londoners relied on wells and pumps that were often contaminated by nearby cesspits. The connection between dirty water and disease was not understood. Epidemic diseases struck regularly. Smallpox was endemic, killing thousands and disfiguring survivors with its characteristic pockmarks. Typhus spread through the crowded tenements and prisons. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was so common as to seem almost normal. Venereal diseases were rampant. Medical care was limited and often ineffective. Physicians served the wealthy, offering treatments based on theories of humors and imbalances that had little connection to actual physiology. Apothecaries sold medicines of dubious value. Surgeons performed operations without anesthesia and without understanding of infection. Many Londoners relied on folk remedies or simply endured their ailments. Chapter 4: Commerce, Industry, and the Economy. The commercial capital. London in 1720 was the commercial heart of an expanding global empire. British trade reached to every corner of the known world, and London was the center through which goods, money, and information flowed. The city's merchants and financiers were accumulating wealth on an unprecedented scale. The Port of London handled the vast majority of England's foreign trade. Ships from the East Indies brought tea, silk, spices, and porcelain. West Indiamen carried sugar, rum, molasses, and coffee from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved Africans. American ships brought tobacco, timber, and furs. European trade brought wine, manufactured goods, and countless other commodities. The custom house collected duties on imported goods, providing a substantial portion of government revenue. The legal quays along the river were perpetually busy, with gangs of workers loading and unloading vessels. Warehouses stored goods, awaiting sale or reshipment. The entire waterfront was devoted to commerce. Export trade was equally important. English woolen cloth remained the most valuable export, shipped to markets throughout Europe and beyond. Manufactured goods of all kinds found markets overseas. Re-exports of colonial goods to European customers added to the trade surplus. London merchants grew wealthy managing these flows of goods. The rise of finance. London was emerging as a financial center of global importance. The institutions that would make it the world's financial capital were taking shape, transforming how money was raised, invested, and transferred. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, had become central to government finance. Created to fund King William's wars against France, the bank managed the national debt, issued banknotes, and provided stability to the financial system. Its notes circulated alongside coin, expanding the money supply and facilitating commerce. The stock market was centered in Exchange Alley, a narrow lane near the Royal Exchange, where brokers gathered to trade shares. Joint stock companies offered shares to investors, raising capital for ventures too large for individual merchants. The East India Company, the Bank of England, and various insurance companies were among the most heavily traded stocks. Insurance was a major business. Lloyd's Coffee House had become the center of maritime insurance, where underwriters assessed risks and offered policies covering ships and cargoes. The great trading ventures of the age required insurance against the perils of the sea, and London's insurers provided it. The South Sea Bubble. The year 1720 was marked by one of history's most spectacular financial manias and crashes, the South Sea Bubble. This catastrophe shaped the year and would influence attitudes towards speculation for generations. The South Sea Company had been founded in 1711, ostensibly to trade with South America, but its real business was managing government debt. In early 1720, the company proposed to take over most of the national debt in exchange for shares in the company. Parliament approved the scheme, and speculation began. Through the spring and summer of 1720, South Sea stock rose to fantastic heights. From about £100 at the start of the year, shares reached £1,000 by midsummer. Everyone seemed to be speculating, lords and merchants, widows and servants, anyone who could scrape together money to invest. Fortunes were made on paper almost overnight. Other speculative ventures proliferated. Companies were promoted for every conceivable purpose, some legitimate, others absurd. One famous prospectus offered shares in a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Investors poured money into schemes they barely understood. The bubble burst in the autumn. South Sea stock collapsed, falling back towards its starting price and below. Fortunes vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Those who had borrowed to invest were ruined. Anger focused on the company directors and the politicians who had supported them. The aftermath was severe. Parliamentary investigations exposed corruption and incompetence. Some directors were stripped of their assets. Several committed suicide. Others faced public disgrace. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was imprisoned in the Tower. Robert Walpole, who had warned against the scheme, emerged as the dominant political figure and would lead the government for 2 decades. Trade and manufacturing. Beyond finance, London's economy rested on trade and manufacturing. The city was both a center of distribution and a producer of goods, though most manufacturing was organized in small workshops rather than large factories. The great trading companies organized much of Britain's overseas commerce. The East India Company held a monopoly on trade with Asia, importing tea, silk, and spices, while exporting English goods. The Royal African Company traded in slaves and African commodities. These companies employed thousands directly and supported countless other businesses. Manufacturing in London covered an enormous range of products. The silk weavers of Spitalfields produced fine fabrics. Watchmakers created precision instruments. Furniture makers, silversmiths, coach builders, and countless other craftsmen produced goods for the wealthy. Printing and publishing flourished, producing newspapers, books, and pamphlets. The building trades employed thousands in constructing and maintaining London's houses, shops, and public buildings. Carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, glaziers, and other craftsmen were constantly at work as the city expanded. The demand for building workers seemed insatiable. Food processing was another major industry. Breweries produced the vast quantities of beer consumed by Londoners. Sugar refineries processed raw sugar from the Caribbean. Slaughterhouses killed the animals that fed the city. These industries employed many workers and generated considerable wealth. Shops and markets. Retail trade served every level of London's society, from the aristocrat seeking luxuries to the laborer buying bread. The variety and sophistication of London's shops astonished visitors from abroad. The great shopping streets were becoming renowned. The Strand featured goldsmiths and jewelers. Fleet Street had booksellers and stationers. Cheapside in the city was lined with drapers and mercers selling fabrics. Covent Garden combined retail shops with the great fruit and vegetable market. Shop displays were becoming more elaborate. Large glass windows allowed merchants to display their wares attractively. Signs hung above doors, identifying businesses for those who could not read and distinguishing one shop from another. Competition for customers was intense. Markets served the daily needs of households. Smithfield was the great livestock market, where animals were driven for slaughter. Billingsgate sold fish brought from the coast and the Thames. Leadenhall and other markets sold meat, poultry, and other provisions. Covent Garden's markets supplied fruits and vegetables. For the poor, street vendors and small shops provided necessities. Hawkers sold everything from hot pies to old clothes to brooms. Chandlers sold candles, soap, and other household needs in small quantities affordable to those with limited means. Pawnbrokers provided credit to those who had goods to pledge. Chapter 5: Government, Law, and Order. The King and Parliament. Britain in 1720 was a constitutional monarchy, governed by king and parliament together. King George I had been on the throne since 1714, when he arrived from Hanover as the Protestant heir under the Act of Settlement. His limited English and foreign origins made him unpopular with some, but the Protestant succession had been secured. George I relied heavily on his ministers to govern. His limited English made it difficult for him to participate in discussions, and he often communicated through interpreters or in French, which he spoke fluently. This reliance on ministers strengthened the developing practice of cabinet government. Robert Walpole was emerging as the dominant figure in government. His steady handling of the South Sea bubble crisis had established his reputation for competence. He would become what later historians would call the first prime minister, though the title was not yet used officially. Parliament consisted of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The Lords included hereditary peers, bishops of the Church of England, and Scottish peers elected for each session. The Commons was elected, though by a franchise so limited and corrupted that it bore little resemblance to democracy. The electoral system was notoriously irregular. Some constituencies with tiny populations returned 2 members, while growing cities had no representation. Voting was public, and bribery, treating, and intimidation were common. Property qualifications restricted the franchise to a small percentage of adult males. The Jacobite threat. The Hanoverian succession remained contested. Supporters of the exiled Stuart dynasty, known as Jacobites, hoped to restore the Catholic James III, the old pretender, to the throne. A major rebellion in 1715 had been defeated, but the threat persisted. Jacobite sentiment was strongest in Scotland and among Catholics, though some Anglicans also retained Stuart sympathies. The exiled court at Rome maintained contacts in Britain and plotted constantly. Foreign powers, particularly France and Spain, sometimes supported Jacobite schemes as a way to weaken Britain. The government took the Jacobite threat seriously. Suspected Jacobites were watched, and those who expressed treasonous sentiments risked prosecution. Catholics faced severe legal restrictions on worship, property ownership, and office holding. The Test Act required all office holders to receive communion in the Church of England. The succession question influenced all politics. Whigs presented themselves as defenders of the Protestant succession and the Revolution settlement of 1688. Tories, though generally loyal to George I, were suspected of Jacobite sympathies. The Whig dominance that Walpole would consolidate was partly built on identifying Tories with the Jacobite threat. Local government. London's governance was a complicated patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions. There was no single authority responsible for the entire metropolis. Instead, various bodies exercised limited powers over portions of the city. The City of London, the ancient square mile, was governed by the Lord Mayor, the Court of Aldermen, and the Court of Common Council. This corporation exercised extensive powers within its boundaries, maintaining courts, collecting taxes, and regulating trade. The city jealously guarded its ancient privileges against encroachment. Westminster was governed differently, with authority divided among various bodies. The parishes of the growing West End each had their own vestries, responsible for poor relief, road maintenance, and other local matters. Coordination was minimal, and the quality of local government varied widely. This fragmented system was increasingly inadequate for the growing metropolis. Streets were poorly maintained, sanitation was neglected, services that modern cities would consider essential simply did not exist, but vested interests resisted reform, and comprehensive metropolitan government would not emerge for over a century. Crime and policing. Crime was rampant in 1720 London, and the response was often ineffective. There was no professional police force. The ancient system of constables and watchmen was poorly suited to a city of 600,000 people. Parish constables were supposed to maintain order, but the position was unpaid and served by rotation among householders. Those who could afford to hire substitutes did so, resulting in constables who were often elderly, infirm, or simply incompetent. Their powers were limited, and they had little ability to investigate crimes. The watch patrolled the streets at night, calling the hours and watching for disturbances. Watchmen were typically old men earning minimal wages, and they were notorious for sleeping in their watch boxes or retreating from any actual trouble. They were objects of ridicule and frequently failed to prevent crimes. Jonathan Wild dominated London's criminal underworld in 1720. Styling himself as a thief-taker, Wild ran a sophisticated operation. He organized gangs of thieves, received stolen goods, and then offered to recover the goods for their owners in exchange for fees. Those criminals who defied him were betrayed to the authorities. His dual role as crime boss and crime fighter would eventually lead to his execution in 1725. The Bow Street Court and others processed criminals, but catching them was largely left to victims and private individuals. Rewards were offered for the apprehension of criminals, creating the thief-taker profession that Wilde had exploited. This system was inherently corrupt, with thief-takers sometimes organizing the crimes they later solved. The criminal law and punishment. The criminal law was notoriously severe. The Bloody Code prescribed death for a vast range of offenses, from murder to pickpocketing to stealing from a shop. The list of capital crimes would continue to grow throughout the century, though in practice various mechanisms mitigated the law's harshness. Juries often refused to convict on capital charges, particularly for minor offenses. They might find a thief guilty of stealing goods valued at less than a shilling, even when the actual value was clearly higher, thus reducing the charge to a non-capital offense. Judges could recommend mercy, and the monarch granted pardons in many cases. Transportation was becoming an alternative to execution for many convicted felons. From 1718, convicts could be transported to the American colonies, where they served terms of 7 or 14 years as bound laborers. This system removed criminals from Britain while providing cheap labor for colonial planters. Those who were executed met their fate in public. Tyburn, at the western end of Oxford Street, was the primary place of execution. 8 hanging days each year drew enormous crowds who treated the occasion as entertainment. The condemned were paraded through the streets, and vast mobs gathered to watch them die. Prisons held those awaiting trial, debtors, and some convicted criminals. Conditions were appalling, overcrowded, unsanitary, and corrupt. Prisoners had to pay for everything, including their food and the removal of their chains. Those without money suffered terribly. Jail fever, typhus, was endemic, and many prisoners died before their cases were heard. Chapter 6: Culture, Religion, and Entertainment. The Church of England. The Church of England was the established church, enjoying privileges and responsibilities that made it central to national life. Bishops sat in the House of Lords. The church conducted marriages, christenings, and burials. Parish boundaries organized local government as well as religious life. Religious practice varied widely. The wealthy attended fashionable churches as a social obligation, displaying their fine clothes and their piety in equal measure. The middling sort often took religion more seriously, seeking spiritual guidance and moral instruction. The poor might attend church or might not. The established church often struggled to reach the urban masses. The High Church and Low Church parties contended within the Church of England. High Churchmen emphasized tradition, ceremony, and the authority of bishops. Low Churchmen stressed preaching, personal faith, and Protestant simplicity. Political alignments often followed religious ones, with High Churchmen tending toward Toryism and Low Churchmen toward Whiggery. The clergy ranged from wealthy bishops living in palaces to impoverished curates barely surviving on tiny stipends. Church livings varied enormously in value, and the system of patronage that controlled appointments often had more to do with social connections than spiritual calling. Pluralism, holding multiple livings simultaneously, was common among the better-connected clergy. Dissent and toleration. Protestant dissenters who refused to conform to the Church of England were tolerated but faced legal disabilities. The Toleration Act of 1689 allowed them to worship freely, but the Test and Corporation Acts barred them from public office and the universities. Presbyterians, Baptists, Independents, Congregationalists, and Quakers maintained their own meeting houses and congregations. Some dissenting groups were declining in numbers, others were vigorous. Their members were often prominent in trade and industry, perhaps partly because exclusion from politics channeled their energies into commerce. Occasional conformity allowed some dissenters to hold office by occasionally attending Anglican communion, though this practice was controversial. Attempts to close this loophole had been politically contentious, and the issue reflected broader conflicts about the nature of religious establishment. Roman Catholics faced more severe restrictions. Catholic worship was illegal, though often quietly tolerated. Catholics could not vote, hold office, or attend universities. Fears of Catholic plotting, associated with the Jacobite threat, kept anti-Catholic laws in place. A small Catholic population persisted, worshipping in private chapels and maintaining their faith despite persecution. Coffee houses and clubs. Coffee houses were central institutions in London's social and commercial life. These establishments served as meeting places, news sources, and centers of specific trades or interests. For the price of a penny cup of coffee, a man could spend hours reading newspapers, exchanging gossip, and conducting business. Different coffee houses catered to different clienteles. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley was where stockbrokers gathered to trade shares. Lloyd's Coffee House was the center of maritime insurance. Political groups, literary circles, and professional associations each had their favorite establishments. The atmosphere was relatively democratic. Men of different ranks mixed in coffee houses in ways they would not elsewhere. Conversation was the primary activity, and the exchange of information and ideas was valued. Critics complained that coffee houses encouraged idleness and sedition, but they remained popular. Private clubs were becoming fashionable among the elite. White's Chocolate House, founded in 1693, was evolving into an exclusive gentlemen's club. These establishments offered gambling, dining, and social networking in more refined surroundings than the public coffee houses. Club membership was a marker of social status. Taverns and alehouses served those seeking stronger drink and rowdier company. These establishments ranged from respectable public houses to disreputable dens frequented by criminals. Drinking was heavy by modern standards, and drunkenness was common at all levels of society. Theater and entertainment. London was the theatrical capital of the English-speaking world. Two patent theaters, Drury Lane and Lincoln's Inn Fields, soon to move to Covent Garden, held monopolies on legitimate drama. Their performances drew audiences from every level of society. The repertoire mixed revivals of Shakespeare and Restoration comedies with new works. Tragedy and comedy were the primary genres, though increasingly elaborate staging and musical elements were becoming popular. The great actors and actresses of the day were celebrities, their performances discussed throughout the town. Theater audiences were notoriously rowdy. Spectators freely expressed their opinions during performances, applauding, hissing, or even throwing things at actors who displeased them. Riots occasionally broke out over disputes about performers or pricing. The theater was entertainment, but it was also a social battleground. Opera was becoming fashionable among the elite. Italian opera, sung in a language most audience members did not understand, offered spectacle, beautiful music, and opportunities to display one's cultivation. The composer Handel had arrived in London and would soon dominate the musical scene. Other entertainments abounded. Pleasure gardens at Vauxhall offered outdoor diversions. Bear baiting and bull baiting drew crowds to arenas where animals fought. Public executions attracted vast mobs. Fairs, puppet shows, and street performers provided entertainment for all classes. Print culture. London was the center of English print culture. Newspapers, books, pamphlets, and every form of printed matter flowed from the presses concentrated around St. Paul's Cathedral. Literacy was spreading, and the appetite for reading material was growing. Newspapers had proliferated since the lapsing of the Licensing Act in 1695. Daily newspapers reported news and gossip. Weekly and monthly publications offered more considered commentary. Political newspapers were often partisan organs, funded by factions to advance their views. Pamphlets debated every conceivable topic. Politics, religion, economics, science, and scandal. The pamphlet war was a characteristic feature of the age, with writers attacking their opponents in print and defending their patrons. Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe, and other literary figures participated in these polemical exchanges. Book publishing was flourishing. The novel was emerging as a significant literary form. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe had appeared in 1719. Poetry remained prestigious, and Alexander Pope was establishing his reputation. Works of history, theology, science, and practical instruction found ready markets. Science and learning. The early Enlightenment was transforming how educated people understood the world. Newton's physics, published decades earlier, had established new foundations for natural philosophy. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, continued to promote scientific investigation. Science remained largely the province of gentlemen amateurs, though some made their living through teaching, writing, or technical work. Experiments were conducted, observations recorded, and papers read before learned societies. The boundaries between science, medicine, and natural philosophy were unclear. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge educated the sons of the elite in classical languages, philosophy, and theology. Their curricula were traditional, and some reformers criticized them as backwards, but they remained the path to the professions of law, medicine, and the church. Education for the middling sort might include charity schools, dissenting academies, or private instruction. Literacy was spreading, though it remained far from universal. The ability to read and write was increasingly necessary for commercial success, and parents who could afford it sought education for their children. Conclusion. London in 1720 was a city of remarkable energy and contradictions. It was the largest city in Western Europe, the capital of a growing empire, and a center of commerce, culture, and political power. Yet, it was also a place of desperate poverty, rampant crime, and appalling living conditions for the majority of its inhabitants. The city had been transformed by the Great Fire of 1666, and the rebuilt London of brick and stone was safer and more orderly than the medieval timber city that had burned. Christopher Wren's churches, particularly the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral, had given the city a new architectural identity. The foundations of modern London were being laid. The year 1720 itself was dominated by the South Sea Bubble, one of history's great financial manias and crashes. The speculation that had gripped the nation ended in disaster, ruining thousands and discrediting many political leaders. The aftermath would shape British politics and attitudes toward finance for generations. 600,000 people made their lives in this city of extremes. The wealthy enjoyed comforts and luxuries on a scale their grandparents could barely have imagined. The poor endured hardships that shocked contemporary observers and would eventually prompt reform. The middle ranks navigated between these extremes, striving for security and respectability. Crime and disorder were constant concerns. Without professional police, London relied on amateur constables, corrupt thief-takers, and the threat of savage punishment to maintain order. The results were imperfect at best, and the criminal underworld flourished despite the gallows at Tyburn. Religion remained central to public and private life, though its hold was beginning to weaken among some segments of society. The Church of England enjoyed its privileged position, while dissenters and Catholics faced various degrees of restriction. The religious settlements of the previous century remained contested. Culture flourished in this environment of wealth and inequality. The theater entertained audiences from every rank. Coffee houses facilitated the exchange of ideas and information. The printing press spread news, opinion, and literature to a growing reading public. London was a center of intellectual and creative energy. The London of 1720 was neither the medieval city of earlier centuries, nor the Victorian metropolis that would emerge later. It was a city in transition, carrying the inheritance of its past, while being transformed by the forces of commerce, empire, and ideas that would shape the modern world. The men and women who walked its streets were participants in one of history's great urban experiments, building a new kind of city for a new kind of age.